Is it true? Is it possible? Can every diabetic, type 1, type 2, type 1.5, LADA, can every diabetic overcome this affliction which threatens to ruin their health and shorten their life? Well, yeah, it is true, and I'll show you how. Okay, I know some of you are thinking, I must surely be crazy. Diabetes has been the health scourge of this generation, and here I am saying that any and every diabetic can see victory in the fight to overcome it. How could I say such a thing? Surely I must be either irresponsible or stupid or a con man or given to incredible hyperbole. But before you assign me to the intellectual funny farm, I ask you to hear me out for the next few minutes. And then if you want to throw stones, go ahead. Before we go any further, let's think about why diabetes is such a scary and dangerous thing. Some of you have recently been told you are diabetic, and it nearly scared you to death. So why is that? Why do people fear diabetes so much? Well, the answer is they have a good reason to fear it. Diabetes can do tremendous damage to your body. It can destroy your kidneys and put you on dialysis for the rest of your life. It can demolish your circulation until you get gangrene in your feet and legs and force you to have your legs cut off. It can eat away at your vision until you can barely see. It can lop off decades of your life. It can give you heart disease that you would never have if you were not diabetic. Diabetes can indeed be very, very bad news for anyone, type 2, type 1, type 1.5, or LADA. Any kind of diabetes is terrible, and to make matters worse, many doctors are going to tell you, now not all, but many, they're going to tell you diabetes is chronic and progressive. In other words, you're in bad shape now, and it's only going to get worse with every year that you age. Your prospects seem bleak indeed. But there is some wonderful news in this area, and the news is this. Your diabetes does not have to get worse. In fact, it can get better. You can have more victory over diabetes at the age of 60 than you had at 40. In fact, it can get so much better that you can move from being diabetic and having a diabetic A1C to a non-diabetic A1C. From diabetic fasting glucose to non-diabetic fasting glucose. And for many, this happens in a matter of a few months, and for most in less than a year. So let's take a look at why diabetes is so incredibly damaging to your body if it goes unchecked and you make no efforts to change the lifestyle that led you to the precipice of destruction. Diabetes harms people as a result of two things: toxically high glucose and toxically high insulin. Until recently, the glucose got all the attention. Diabetics were given fasting glucose tests and A1Cs to determine if they were in a safe range. If their glucose was too high, they were at risk for all the diabetic complications mentioned earlier. If it was on the lower side, doctors would be satisfied that their patients were doing about the best they could, and they would try to encourage them, even though they knew in their hearts that these unfortunate men and women were still on the path to destruction, but at least they had slowed down the pace a bit. Many doctors were completely satisfied to see their patients' A1Cs somewhere in the 7s, which researchers agree is not at all good for you. The truth is this: consistently high and abnormal blood sugar is destroying you, one day at a time. Now, you can sometimes live for decades with it, but eventually it will wear you down, and you will pay a high price for those numbers that show up on your glucose monitor in the mornings. You know, numbers like 145, 185, 255, and into the 300s, 400s, and sometimes even the 500s. God has designed your blood sugar levels to revolve right around 100 milligrams per deciliter, sometimes going a bit higher after a meal and sometimes dropping a bit lower as you sleep. Typically, a healthy glucose range will shift somewhere between the 80s to about 130. And this is what most of us experienced when we were teens. and we probably lost somewhere in our 20s. Having consistently high glucose levels is like taking small doses of poison. It's not going to kill you immediately, but it will do you a world of harm eventually. By definition, all diabetics battle high glucose levels. All type 1s, type 2s, LADAs, type 1.5, everybody struggles with glucose levels. Type 1s take insulin and try to match their insulin to the meals that they eat, as well as injecting slow-acting insulin every day. You might suppose this would be a fairly easy thing for them to do, simply match their insulin with their meals and stay in a normal range every day, but in truth, most type 1s don't experience that at all. They see surges and spikes of blood sugar that can jump past 200, sometimes past 300. And at other times, they'll inject too much insulin and they'll experience plunges in their glucose called hypos that can cause them to pass out or sometimes even die. Type 2s typically try to control their diabetes through diet, exercise, medications, and limiting their sugar. But they don't usually do any better than the type 1s. Many take their medications faithfully, and they try to watch their sugar, but they still have A1Cs of 8, 9, 10, and higher. And with blood glucose like this, they are headed for disaster. The sad truth is that most diabetics are not in control of their glucose, and they find that their experience is just what their doctor has told them. They are living in a diabetic condition that is both chronic and progressive. In other words, they're getting worse, and nothing seems to help. Okay, what I've just told you so far is fairly non-controversial. Almost everybody would agree with that, I would think. But there is another problem with diabetes that is not spoken of nearly so much, and that is excess insulin. Many type 1 diabetics continue to eat high-carb, high-starch, high-sugar diets. Some still eat pastries, bread, and sugary desserts. And then they hope to make up for it by simply taking more and more insulin. But excess insulin is just about as damaging and deadly as excess blood sugar. In order to desperately try and corral their glucose, they end up taking massive amounts of insulin, which is something your body was never meant to endure. And living in a state of insulinemia, which is simply excess insulin floating around in your bloodstream day after day, month after month, year after year, that condition would be terrible for them, even if they had their glucose down, which most of them do not. Type 2s, likewise, often are dealing with a tremendous insulin load. Now, in their case, it's produced by their own pancreas. Because of their insulin resistance and their unnatural, unhealthy, excessively high-carb diet, their poor pancreas is forced to dump out prodigious amounts of insulin. In many type 2 diabetics, their pancreas is not their problem. Let me repeat that. For many type 2 diabetics, probably most but not all, and only your doctor can tell you this, their pancreas is not their problem. Often it works just fine. In fact, it's overworking and pumping its little guts out trying to keep up with the huge carbohydrate load that these diabetics are forcing into their bodies. Dr. Michael Eads writes this: in the appropriate amount, insulin keeps the metabolic system humming along smoothly with everything in balance. But in great excess, it becomes a rogue hormone ranging throughout the body, wreaking metabolic havoc and leaving a trail of chaos and disease in its wake. So the danger for diabetics is coming from two sources: high glucose and high insulin. And from these two roots, all the horrific complications spring forth. People die, they lose their eyesight, their legs, they have heart attacks and strokes, their veins collapse, they get all kinds of infections and sores that will not heal. In my early struggles with metabolic syndrome, my A1C was still in the so-called normal range. My fasting glucose was not considered diabetic, but I was having all kinds of problems: urinary tract infections, irritable bowel syndrome, frozen shoulders, hypos, arthritis. I fainted once. I had shaking and trembling spells all the time. The doctors were telling me I was not diabetic, but I had serious insulin resistance and terrible blood sugar spikes that could rise over 200 an hour after eating and then plunge down to around 40 or so 3 hours later. This wasn't the result of constantly elevated glucose that was causing most of my problems, but it was the result of terrible glucose spikes plus excess insulin that I was living with every day. Let's imagine you go to a doctor's office and he tells you you have the terrible disease of craniopancreatitis. Now, you've never heard of that, but it sure sounds scary. You ask the doctor, "Are you sure?" And he tells you in a sad voice, "Yes, it's definite. I hated to tell you, but you had to know." So you say to your doctor, "Well, I've never heard of craniopancreatitis. What does it do? Will I die soon?" He says, "No, actually, you should live out your years with this. It doesn't kill you or even shorten your life." So you say, "Well, what does it do? Will I go blind? Will I lose my legs? Will it destroy my organs? What are the effects? What are the complications of this disease?" And he tells you, "Well, actually, there are no negative effects at all. As far as we know, it doesn't harm you physically in any way." Well, you look at the doctor in amazement. You say to him, "Well, why in the world are you sitting there looking so sad? It doesn't kill me. It doesn't harm me in any way. What kind of crazy disease is that?" Well, the truth is, there would be no reason for fear or even having the slightest concern if you had a disease which did not shorten your life and created zero symptoms or complications. Now, here's a question for you. What if diabetes was like that? You say, "Yeah, but it's not. There are terrible complications from diabetes, and it can very easily shorten your life." Well, yes, it can, but remember, the reason that diabetes is so deadly is due to two things: high glucose and high insulin. If you could just put an end to the high glucose and the high insulin, you'd be in the clear. If you want to call yourself a diabetic, fine, but as long as you keep those glucose levels in line and your insulin low, you have an affliction which will not shorten your life and will not give you any kind of physical complications or have any harmful effects whatsoever. So the million-dollar question is there anything, any medicine, any diet, any exercise, any practice at all that will effectively bring my glucose levels and my insulin levels down into the normal range and thereby take that stinger out of diabetes and render it harmless? And the answer is a big fat yes. There is something that will do both. It doesn't cost money, it doesn't require you to be a genius to start using it, and it is freely available. And that answer to both conditions, high glucose and high insulin, is the low-carb diet along with time-restricted eating, which some call intermittent fasting. Now, by low carb, I'm not just talking about you refusing donuts and no longer eating German chocolate cake. Low carb means slashing most of the carbohydrates in your diet. The pasta, the bread, potatoes, rice, nearly all grains, all pastries, all sugar, all fruit juice, most fruits, except for berries and avocados, maybe tomatoes sometimes. It means cutting out starches, sugars, and carbs, and given enough time for the process to work, and combining your low-carb diet with narrowing that window of eating to, say, 6 hours each day, you will never again go through your days with raging insulin. You'll never again wake up to glucose levels at 150, 200, 250 or higher. You'll watch your A1C drop down from double digits into the 6s, the 5s, or for some even the 4s. If you're a type 1, you'll be able, under your doctor's care and supervision, to drop your insulin levels much lower than you thought possible and still get better A1Cs than you used to have back in the diabetic lifestyle that you had. Time-restricted eating is trickier for type 1s, so don't just jump into that. Talk to your doctor about it. But by all means, cut those carbs. You'll find that you can far more accurately dose your mealtime insulin, and you'll rejoice to discover that raging glucose spikes and terrible hypos will nearly be a thing of the past. And if you don't believe me, read and learn from Dr. Richard Bernstein, who is a type 1 himself, and he's in his 80s, and he keeps his A1C score in the 4s. Now, if you're a type 2, you will thrill that very first time when your morning fasting blood sugar drops below 100. You'll find that the low-carb diet can still taste really great. And the satisfaction of getting post-meal blood sugar peaking at 125 or 133 will be a high that no donut or bowl of mac and cheese could ever give you. So what does beating diabetes look like? It looks like this: living into old age with good mobility, keeping your eyesight, keeping your legs, your kidneys working beautifully, your liver in fine shape, no more numbness in your extremities, no more constant infections, no constant urination, finding that your sores and cuts heal up quickly and completely within a couple of weeks. Now, if you're eating low carb with, say, no more than 50 or 60 grams of carbs per day, with most of those carbs coming from vegetables and salads, and you still need to take medications or even insulin, then of course, just do it. Beating diabetes doesn't necessarily mean that you refuse to ever take medications or insulin. Sometimes diabetics have burned out most of their beta cells in their pancreas and they just have to take insulin or medication. In their case, they're not dealing with too much insulin. They've got too little insulin. Their pancreas just isn't putting it out. And it only makes sense that they'd need to supplement or stimulate their body's natural insulin. But so what? There's nothing wrong with that. Some people feel like it would be the end of the world if they had to inject insulin. But the truth is that's nothing. If that's what it takes for you to live into your 80s or 90s and keep your legs and kidneys and eyes and enjoy the life God has given you on this beautiful earth, my friend, that is a small price to pay. If a doctor said to me, "Dennis, your pancreas is barely functioning. You'll have to start injecting insulin regularly," I would do it in a heartbeat. It would be a small price to pay for my health and to enjoy a long, active, healthy life. But you can be sure that if I did have to inject insulin, I would never, let me say it again, I would never use that as an excuse to pig out on pasta and bread and rice and chocolate cake and Snicker bars and guzzle sodas all day long. I'd still eat low carb. In fact, I'd probably lower my carbs even more than I do now and simply match small amounts of insulin with my low carb meals. And I would call that beating diabetes. And for type 2 diabetics with good pancreatic function but who are dealing with insulin resistance, the answer is still a low-carb diet and time-restricted eating. Whatever your diabetic situation, you can quiet the storm of raging high blood sugar and raging high insulin levels with a diet that does not provoke those two things, and that means slashing the carbohydrates that have brought you to the edge of disaster. And as you do this and allow time to bring about your healing, the storm will become silent. The winds and the flames of diabetes will weaken and die, and you'll have the thrill of beating a bully that has been thought unbeatable.